What I'm giving, got some ambition, this new edition, filling positions, looking at the void in myself and feeling what's missing. Better watch the way you going, better go in the right direction. In the moment you stressing, but you gon' be counting blessings, and I know that for certain. Keep on working, open curtains, haters swerving, cause they ain't ready for your final version. Whoa. I'm never gonna give up, fall down, I just gotta get up.
You're listening to the Tom Ficklin Show on WNHHLP 103.5 FM, your home for community radio.
Good morning, New Haven. Good morning, Connecticut. I got a great show for us today. I got three fantastic, legendary educational activists here. I mean, I can't, if I had to write out their CVs on here, we'd be going into next year. The accomplishments are so long, so great. But I'm going to take you there. But let me remind you that I'm Dr. Jesse P. Turner, the Central Connecticut State University Literacy Center Director, AKA the Walking Man. And I'm over here with the fabulous Tim Slacker, who served as the Dean of Education at Edgewood College in Wisconsin for about 7 years. And now he was also one of the founding members of, get this, School of Education Deans for Social Justice. We got another member here too, Julian there. But if there was ever a need for social justice deans, it's today. And so this is just good stuff. But and he also is currently, his current work is with, he's doing consulting with Touro University of California, working on that. And I'm hoping we grab him and have him come to Connecticut and do some work with us. That would be great. And so that's great. We also have the fabulous Dr. Julian Velasquez Helic, Dean of the University of Kentucky. And I am telling you, this is a legendary blogger with over 1 million blogs. When Teach for America was trying to take over the world, Julian stood up and put the brakes on that and said, hold it, I'm going to give you the research. But it's not only that. He has been probably our nation's most prolific research writer and pointer to the truth and the data, what really matters with equity. And if you're not reading Cloaking Inequity, then you're just not reading, because you have to follow Julian. If you don't, I think you shouldn't be in education. I'm gonna just, seriously, and they're gonna do a little self-promoting themselves. And then I have my fabulous sister, Dr. Denisha Jones from Sarah Lawrence College in New York, badass teacher, defending the early years, uniting to save our schools, you name it. Was there in 2011, and Tim was too, in 2011 when we're rallying, marching in DC with Save Our Schools. Oh yeah, so today I have a show for you. And I'm hoping, I'm old school. I'm like, you know, if people know me, they say, oh no, he had a bit of that Jesus stuff in him, young and stuff. And it's like, I'm calling like, hey man, I'm calling, this is a spiritual rise in here today. And I want to have a theme for today, because I have three exceptional researchers and educational activists, and I believe they are the future. And they are going to take us to the place that brings us where justice flows like water. Dr. King said, we know it's going to. I know it. But I want to do today a little different. They're going to highlight themselves, but I want to play off, this is Poetry Month, April, right, Denisha? And, you know, so Judith Boyce has this great kids poem that I love to use. And yes, kids, but it's adults too. And she says, if I were in charge of the world, I'd cancel oatmeal Monday mornings, allergy shots, and Sarah Steinberg. If I were in charge of the world, there'd be brighter night lights, healthier hamsters, basketballs, 48 inches lower. You know, if I were in charge of the world. So today, if social justice in charge of the world, today, as if teacher education program directors, social justice warriors were in charge of the world. So I want to begin with, I'm going to go in order of how I met people. So I first met Denisha, who Save Our Schools, when we were working on that with American University. Then I met Tim actually on the march, my wife and him, and I think our kids or something were walking together over to the rally over there. And then I met Julian. I followed Julian long before I met him, because you have Julian's work after over there. And Julian came to Connecticut about 5 years ago too, and Robert Codal and a bunch of Connecticut people. We just fell in love with Julian there. So Julian, you have a real fan over here, to let you know that. So I'm going to begin. Denisha, if you were in charge of the world, what would teacher education look like?
Wow, Jesse, that's a really great question. If I was in charge of the world. So, I've been theorizing and thinking about the metaphor that Rudine Sims Bishop, or Bishop Sims Bishop, gave us about this idea of, she talked about literature, right? And this idea of mirrors and sliding glass doors and windows, right? And so I've been thinking about the curriculum, right? And the curriculum as a mirror, as a sliding glass door, and as a window, right? So in a mirror, the curriculum would reflect all students, right? You could see yourself in that curriculum. As a sliding glass door, the curriculum would invite you to be a part of the history of this country, and the window would be a passage into the future. Right? And the curriculum should provide all three. And what we know is that it doesn't provide all three for all children, right? The mirror of the curriculum is a bad reflection if you're not white, rich, Christian, able-bodied, heterosexual, and part of the gender binary, right? That mirror doesn't reflect your image really well. Right. And the history, the sliding glass door to history, is it doesn't work for you, right? It doesn't paint your history in a good light. It doesn't show your contributions to this country. And the future is only attainable if you assimilate into something that you're not, right? So how do we shift the curriculum, right? So that mirror is a reflection, so that sliding glass door looks at history correctly, and that window of future really shows the liberation of all people. So I would work on that in teacher education if I was in charge of it. Right? I would really think about, what are we doing to prepare teachers to grapple with this idea of a curriculum that doesn't meet the needs of all students, intentionally doesn't meet the needs of all students, right? We have to reckon with that. We're not accidentally not educating children well. We are intentionally not educating certain children well, and that needs to stop, right? And so I would put a big emphasis on that. And it's important that we look historically, right, of how that's been done since the beginning, and how it's happening, and what it means for our future. And how do can we, I also think a lot about Audre Lorde, and, you talked about poetry, right? And her poetry is great, but also her essays and her concept of this idea of the master's tool will never destroy the master's house. And right, we know education is a tool of all the systems that we have in place. It can be, right? It's a tool to fuel the status quo. Capitalism and patriarchy and racism and white supremacy can all be supported through education, but it doesn't have to be, right? Can it be a tool of liberation? Can it be a tool of emancipation? And I think that's the work of teacher education, really preparing students who grapple deeply with that idea that the way things are not okay, and that we have the power and the commitment and responsibility to make things in our work. And I feel like we do that really well at Sarah Lawrence, because we focus so much on getting to know children. Forget these standards, forget this nonsense about what they're supposed to be doing, these assessments. If you don't know who children are, then you're not qualified to teach them. And we spend an entire year learning how to observe children, not how we want them to be, but who they are. What do they think about? What do they talk about? What do they do? What do they like? How do they construct knowledge? How do they engage with other people? That's so fundamental. And I've been in higher ed for almost 20 years now. This is the first school that I've seen really take attention to that idea, that you have to observe children and get to know them well and deeply, right? And then while you're doing that, think about instruction, think about learning, think about teaching, and then also think about history in the fight for educational justice, right? And so it's a deep process, but I tell you what, our students come out committed, because they see the light, right? They see that there's another world that's possible. And I want everyone to have that. You shouldn't have to come just to Sarah Lawrence to get that type of teacher education. We need to make this the standard across all. That's what I would do if I was in charge of the world.
And I got to say a good amen to that. And I'm going to bring us to Tim now, because I think what Denise is talking about is exactly what we should be doing, but it's not what we're really doing.
Yeah, I was just like, okay, Denisha absolutely nailed what it should be. And it's awesome to hear what they're doing with her. And I'm absolutely not amazed that Denisha would be at a place advocating and doing that work, because that's who she is. And Denisha, thank you for doing that. What if I were, I would really take this and move what Denisha's talking about and saying, and recognize, why is that not happening in teacher education first, broadly? And that's what we try to talk about with Education Deans for Justice and Equity. What are the systemic structures in place within teacher education that are even forbidding that? But then I'm really thinking now really hard about how teacher education needs to be deeply embedded in schools, and looking at our K-12 brothers and sisters as our colleagues, and recognizing that to do the work Denisha wants them to do, we need to be in support of teachers who are right now demoralized, who have been moving out of the profession faster than we've ever seen. We have an exodus. People call it a shortage. I said, no, we don't have a shortage of people. We have an exodus of people. If we have an exodus of people leaving the profession, and we've got ambitions like Denisha was talking about, those aren't going to work together complementary. And so I'm looking at that side of saying, yes, let's bring in that passion and that power, because of the teachers that I've been working with, 395 of them working on, every one of them wants to do what Denisha's talking about. Every one of them has felt, though, at this point, some sense of saying, the system won't let me. It's pressuring me to do those other things. I need to get out. That's frightening. So how does teacher education move itself into a place of partnership with our K-12 to understand, to make this reality happen? You, K-12 teachers, we're colleagues in this mission. We're doing this together. Teacher education has to be in a deep partnership within communities, so that Denisha can say, let's look at that mirror. Hey, guess what? Teacher education, let's put that mirror up in our own faces too, and say, what are we actually seeing? And if we don't like what we're seeing, then we need to start moving into and recognizing that maybe we've been too disconnected from the K-12 system ourselves, and recognize that actually when teachers are demoralized, teacher education is also going to then become demoralized too. So the fate of teachers is also going to be the fate of teacher education. So when you think about justice and equity, and I really like, I'm not going to get into the particulars the way Denisha did, because she did that so awesome. So I'm taking a more broad view of teacher education and saying, to do that work, we need to embed ourselves in the communities. Let that mirror shine a light of who those communities are. And then teacher education, how do we become in relationship, in community partnership with K-12, with the communities they serve, so that we can together take teachers out of a demoralized state, bring in new teachers who are passionate to do this work, and ignite that passion for justice and equity. Because every teacher in my survey said, if I were to stay in the profession, what I need is agency to make a difference. The difference that I wanted to make when I got into this profession that drove me to be a teacher, I need to be able to do that again.
So now we come to the perfect spot, because we're moving up from teacher education to that concept. But I believe there's a place that's starting to, well, leave since Dean Vasquez-Hillick entered into the University of Kentucky School of Education as their dean, that he's been building these partnerships. We've done a show with Julian and Vincent on the Civil Rights Initiative, NAAC partnerships. Julian, if you were in charge of the world, if the dean of the University of Kentucky School of Education were in charge of the world, what would it look like?
I'm going to tell you, you all have inspired so many thoughts. My brain is swirling around a lot of topics right now. But I think that there are storm clouds on the horizon. We met with some superintendents recently, the local superintendents. They're really concerned about the fact that educators are retiring. They're hanging up their spikes. And so I want to talk about that first. Then I'll talk about the social justice piece, which is that this issue is coming fast, and we've got to think about what our response is going to be. So in Texas, when they had a teacher shortage, what they did was they said, you can have 30 hours of anything and be in the classroom as soon as that's done. So you could say to yourself, you see the billboard driving down the highway, become a teacher, log on to this website, get 30 hours. And so we were at the point in Texas where 60 to 70% of teachers were alternatively certified, which is a wide range of training to hit the classroom. And so that's how Texas dealt with this problem. So in California, they said, well, you know what we want to do is we want to raise standards. We want to make sure that every kid has a high quality teacher. But then there were still back doors, like Teach for America. And so this is all going to come to a head. So we need to be prepared. The challenge has been that education has had a lot of complexity over the last year, a lot of instability related to the pandemic. And so you see lots of teachers deciding that they're going to leave the profession. We've got to think about what that response is going to be in the fall. The response of the superintendents that I spoke with was, how can we get alternative certification and how can we scale it up dramatically and quickly? The question wasn't, how are we going to recruit high-level teachers from the University of Kentucky and other universities to fill this need? And how can we ensure that we keep the teachers that want to leave? You know, I don't know if you know, but I can sing a little bit. And there's that old song, there's a hole in my bucket, dear Liza, dear Liza. And so the thing is that we in higher education train enough teachers so that there should not be a shortage. But what happens is when they get out into the field, they run into all the issues that you have written about, Jesse, that you've talked about, and then other folks in this call. So I think we need to be prepared. The storm clouds are on the horizon, and we need to make sure that communities and policymakers understand the consequences of decisions of bringing in educators that are not truly prepared for the classroom. And that has implications for achievement, for school discipline, et cetera. So that's the first thing. The second thing I'd like to talk about is the justice and equity piece. And I've been so honored to serve on the steering committee of education deans for justice and equity. Unfortunately, I was not a dean when the organization began, so not a founding member. But that work with Kevin Kumashiro and my colleagues at colleges of education across the United States is key. More than 300 members of that organization and doing important work. So let me talk quickly about the University of Kentucky. I think the first thing is that you as a community should not have to wait for results. You shouldn't have to wait for results from a principal. You shouldn't have to wait for results from a superintendent. You shouldn't have to wait for results from a secretary of education. Those leaders should be able to deliver results together with the community in a dialogic process right away. Communities are tired of waiting for success. So often you see these folks, especially in higher education, you see folks now that after the George Floyd murder, you see academics saying, I am a diversity champion. But if you look at their record, there's nothing in their record that demonstrates that they actually are a diversity champion. And I think that goes for principals, for superintendents, et cetera. We as a community, you know, let's talk about dating for a minute, right? So often you go on a date and it doesn't work out, or you have a partner, it doesn't work out. And that's because you use the wrong criteria to choose that date or choose that partner. And so why are we so disappointed when that principal, when that superintendent, when that dean, when that policymaker doesn't deliver for us? It's because we used the wrong criteria or did not use the right data to understand what their record was. So I think it's important that we look at our record at the University of Kentucky over the past couple of years. We've doubled the number of people of color in our teacher ed program. We've doubled the number of African Americans that we admitted this year. Right now, we're 4% ahead of where we have been in the past in students of color in our College of Education. We have to hold our leaders accountable for results. There's a lot of folks out there that talk a good game, whether they're anywhere across the spectrum in education leaders, but their record isn't a record around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and they haven't delivered results. And so that's what we have to do. Right now, we're interviewing superintendent candidates here in Fayette County, which is a large district for Lexington. And that's what's important to me when I'm having conversations with these folks is what is their record? What are the results? They may talk a good game, but what are the results that they've delivered for communities in the short term and the long term?
Good, excellent. Now we're going to continue, but I'm going to give that stuff. What if the walking man was in charge? Well, first thing I'm going to remember that Coretta Scott King said, I must remind you that starving a child is violence. Neglecting school children is violence. Punishing a mother and a family is violence. Discrimination against a working man is violence. Ghetto housing is violence. Ignoring medical need is violence. Contempt for poverty is violence. And I would say that our K-12 system is in a state of violence against poor children, children of color, communities of color, immigrant communities. And I would say that what do we need to do? It's what I've always done, you know. So in '63, I was 8 years old with my grandfather in DC in '63 when Martin spoke. You stand up, you walk. I'm looking for a rising of activists, not only teacher educators, parents, communities. That's why I love that idea. And we're going to have to talk a little more about that partnership with the civil rights, with the NAACP and the University of Kentucky. Because it's, for me, if I were in charge of the world, there would have been one man walking 400 miles to DC in 2010. There would have been 2 million people marching. If I were in charge of the world, AFT, NEA, American Association for University Professors, millions of them would be showing up in DC and pestering those legislators and not letting them go home. Not sedition, not acts of violence, not attacks, but acts of lobbying, of asking our legislators to do moral justice to our nation. So yeah, if I were in charge of the world, our parents would stand up, our teachers would stand up, our universities would stand up, and we would stand up for the poor. We would stand up for the needy. We would stand up for those that need it most. Yes, and I wouldn't be standing up for any billionaires at the moment. But Julian, I want to come back to you for a moment, because one of the beautiful things that's happening at the University of Kentucky is this partnership with the NAACP and the Civil Rights Initiative, because you know education is civil rights. Civil rights is education. And you've got this partnership. Could you tell us a little bit about that? Because today is a day of open glory.
No, absolutely. You know, five years ago, I think we were together in Hartford, right? And the topic of conversation that day was community-based education reform. Now, the concepts that I was working through at that time was the idea that there's a suite of education reform options that are community-driven and community-based, and that are not in the vein of the top-down private control and privatization education reform that has dominated the landscape for about the last 15, 20 years or so, and some of those things even before that. So that was our conversation. And so one of the great things about being entrusted with this job by the faculty and the students and the leaders of this university is being able to deliver on that work at scale for a college. And so one of the first things that we did when we came in was say, you know what, we need to think about research in a different way. So often faculty, we have these good ideas for research. And then what we do is we go into communities and we conduct that research almost in a colonial fashion. And so the idea was, how can we do research in a different way, where communities drive the research that we do, where communities come to us with good ideas, where we partner with communities on grants. So community engaged, community driven research, which is completely different than probably any other research center you've ever heard of, okay? And so I have had a history working in the modern civil rights movement, first with the Texas NAACP on some work with the OCR. Then in California on the executive committee and as education chair, and now as co-education chair and on the executive committee of the Kentucky NAACP. So about 10 years of volunteering inside the NAACP on whatever needed to be done. And so I knew that in 2017, the NAACP passed a national resolution at the national convention to open a new civil rights center. So I approached CEO Derek Johnson. I said, look, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity. This is a one-of-a-kind opportunity to have the NAACP create its first collaboration ever with an institution of higher education for this new civil rights center that was passed in this resolution. And the focus of the center would be to work with communities to conduct research. And so it's a first of a kind. We announced it just after George Floyd's murder. However, we had been working on it for an entire year on the relationships, the MOUs, et cetera. So check out the website at NAACP Education and Civil Rights Initiative at the University of Kentucky. We're doing work in Paducah and San Francisco and in many cities across the United States. It's not just Kentucky work. This is national work. We wanted the University of Kentucky College of Education to be the center of the conversation on community-based, community-engaged research in education.
And that's why Julian was my choice for Secretary of Education in the U.S. and not Connecticut's Miguel Cardona. You were my choice, sir. I want to
check the mail. Thank you for being so kind.
Yeah, just got to tell you there. But Tim, I want to come to you because what people don't know about you is that you're an activist. I mean, you're like a crazy activist. You're the guy that not only, yes, you went to DC and you marched with us, but then you occupied the United States Department of Education. I think in 2012, 2013, I know I was there. We were sitting outside. You took the bullhorn, ran over to the White House and started shouting at the president, fighting for equity. And you really were taking on high stakes assessment, which I tell parents every day. I say, you want the money, $1.7 billion every single year. And that's just the Fed money. We could double that easily. We're probably talking $4 to $5 billion a year. And if we look in 2010, when we started this disaster, we go back to 2002, the No Child Left Behind, the original funding day, we are talking about $100 billion. For what? Well, Tim, could you tell us what about this assessment? Because I think the assessment, when Denisha said it's intentional, I know it's intentional. And I know what matters and what I tell my parents, I say, there's the data that counts and there's the data that really counts. I tell them the data that counts for policymakers, legislators, and sometimes our superintendents are test scores. And I say, but the data that really counts is the data that was collected with the teacher that was sitting next to your child this day in that classroom. Nobody is more knowledgeable other than you about your child. So Tim, could you give us a little bit about this assessment stuff?
You know, and since No Child Left Behind, I mean, there's this incredible history there of pain, right? But now in 2021, and we said this, I mean, I said it in when No Child Left Behind. I mean, understand that in 1983, if anything, let's talk about, there's a small history lesson here, and people can even go further, but, you know, a nation at risk has put us on, and again, I think maybe my job today is to really more do a 30,000 foot kind of view of this, but in 1983, the nation was at risk, and since 1983, the nation has remained at risk, at least according to the public. And we have invested, as you just said. Now, Jesse, if you're talking NCLB, I would like someone to do a real accounting of the amount of money spent fixing schools, because remember, in 1983, they were broken. We have yet to unbreak them, at least according to those people. And the method of solving the problem has been to, quote, test students, because tests were the original revelation that our schools were broken. Again, what does that really mean? And you said, what was the data that we were using to make that claim? What was the data then? Still to this day, when you say that we have achievement gaps, let's really talk about what gaps we really have. If we were talking about gaps, our biggest issue is opportunity gaps. So when you're talking about assessment, understand that when people say that we have an achievement gap, a lot of times, or most of the time, it's a very simplistic measure that's saying simple numeracy, simple literacy skills seem to be out of whack with what we would predict they should be. However, when you're talking about assessment, that's not that test score data, and that's not accountability. One of the biggest reasons for pushing against this for me has always been what is going to be not taught purposely in place of, and in fact, because of saying schools are failing, you need to now double down on literacy, on numeracy, which means if you're doubling down on that, that means you're doubling down on getting rid of something. And so go back to all the way to what Denisha talked about, what schools should look like. If we're continually trying to measure simple numeracy and literacy scores and continue to argue about gaps, we will never, and in fact, this is the purpose of accountability. And it's also the biggest issue driving, as Jillian just said, again, we got to quit calling it a shortage. We got to call it what it is. It's either a reluctance for people to teach. It's teachers at their wits' end who are demoralized and want to get out, and fast tracks and all these things. But accountability over these past 35 years is that systemic problem that we've been fighting against, whether it's occupying, whether it's, and now looking at every type of push against standardized assessments has not been an anti-assessment movement. It's been a move about the fact that the data that you're collecting is really, really wasted money, expensive. It will always prove, and great blogger, Radical Eyes for Equity, Paul Thomas, shows this time and time and time again. If testing and accountability worked in the amount of money we'd spent, why has the gap that we continue to say, if you look at it over these, every year that we've dumped money into accountability, it has remained either open and or continues to widen. It's insanity. So we are spending money constantly to keep in place an incredibly top-down, hierarchical, patriarchal, as you put every word that Denisha said, colonial system. This is a power issue. So now at 2021, recognize the reason why people won't let go of hardcore standardized testing is because if you let go of that, you're out of power. Having that power to control the curriculum through simple arguments of failing schools, that narrative, that commonsensical narrative, Kevin Kumashiro always talks about it this way. When our neighbors commonsensically believe schools are failing, they allow simple, silly ways of reform to get through this. And this is where, coming back to the community deep engagement, how do we bring this together? How do we talk to our neighbors to say, you know what? Schools might be failing, but they might be failing in a way that test scores are not ever going to tell us. And in fact, if we keep looking at test scores, we're never going to get to be able to see the mirror, to see the true failures of schools. That's my biggest push right now, is to say, if we continue down this road of simplistic, high stakes standardized testing and using those as always the driver of political conversations, of elections, of school boards, of whatever you want to do, you never get to the depth of complexity of saying, what are we not teaching? What are kids not learning? Why are teachers feeling demoralized and wanting to leave? We've got 35 years of a top-down standardized assessment system that said curriculum and instruction has been broken. We need to fix it by managing it, by mandating it. Guess what, though? The data now, their own data shows we haven't done a darn thing. Even if you're talking about the achievement gap, we've kept it in place. So for me, the insanity, and it's actually not insanity, it's intentionality to keep this system in place. The system, the failure system, is working beautifully. It keeps teachers demoralized. It keeps kids from getting what they need. It keeps the status quo in place, and it keeps those who are in power. That is, we're starting to see now, when you look at these battles around critical race theory and everything like this, these are pushing people who are worried about losing their unearned status of power. And so if you knock away high stakes standardized assessments, you start knocking at people who are in power, and that scares the hell out of them.
Well, they should be scared. Denisha, I'm going to take you to this piece. We know the deal. We understand that systemic racism is leading the charge. We've got that piece. But what I'm looking for is, I want to know the dream teachers of the future. I want to know what they're like, because I want to be, Julian, you did one of your cloak and inequity stories was on the Florida teacher. who was fired because she had a Black Lives flag in her classroom. So Denisha, I'm asking for, what's that dream teacher? Because I want to go and I want to be in your classes. That's what I want to be. I want to be at Julian's University. I want to be hanging out with the NAACP, with Vincent. I want to be occupying the Department of Education again with Tim. So Denisha, your mission is to tell us, why should we become a teacher? And I didn't become a teacher because I wanted a job. I became a teacher because in my high school classroom of 29 students, by the time I graduated college, there were only 15 of us left. The other half of them were incarcerated or dead. So I didn't become a teacher because I wanted a job. So I want you to tell us, like, inspire those teachers. Tell us what they should be like. I know you got it because you have it, sister. I know it. You are that teacher.
I'm fortunate to work with some really awesome teachers, and not just the students I'm, developing at Sarah Lawrence, but, I've been working with Black Lives Matter at School for the past 4 years, which is a grassroots effort to, again, think about that mirror and that curriculum and to really assert that Black Lives Matter in our classrooms, in our schools, so that they see themselves in the curriculum, right? We have these amazing 13 guiding principles that come from the Black Lives Matter Global Network, right? So it's that kind of Black cultural knowledge that's lacking in the curriculum, right? When I ask my students, what does it mean to teach for Black joy? They're stuck, right? Because we've never talked about that. No one knows what Black joy means because we don't have examples of that. We got a lot of examples of Black pain. We got a lot of examples of Black, supposed inferiority, but we lack the imagination and construction of Black joy in our schools. And that's what Black Lives Matter at School is doing. And so this year I was fortunate to interview several of our teachers for some research that I'm doing. So I can talk a little bit about a couple of my early childhood teachers who are doing this work, because this is what they do, right? Like, this is great how they're bringing this work. So we have a white teacher in New York City who's teaching pre-K, right? And she's talking about, as a self-possessed right liberal, what does that mean, right? What does that mean for teaching predominantly white students in Brooklyn, New York, young students, right? And so she talks about having to explicitly name white supremacy with 4-year-olds. And you can do this developmentally appropriate. She does it all the time, right? And what does that mean for them to see a white teacher saying these things, right? So that will stick with them as they proceed into a world where anti-Blackness is the norm, right? And she's giving them the tools at 4 years old to challenge that. They talk about the 13 guiding principles, they color, but she also asserts to them that they have a responsibility as white people, as white children, to understand why we say Black Lives Matter, because a lot of people think that they don't, right? So she does this work and she takes on this challenge, and it's really interesting because in the beginning she's scared, everyone's a little scared, like, what's gonna happen if I say this to these kids? Guess what? Nothing happens. The kids kind of look at you and go, well, duh, Miss Teacher, of course. And she's like, well, you think that, but actually, right? So that you can get into these really great nuanced conversations about it. We have another kindergarten teacher in New York City who he took the principles that we have and she wrote them for young children, which was amazing, right? She put them in that language so that we can really talk about them with young children. And she talks about, 5-year-olds learning about intersectionality by reading about Rosa Parks and thinking about Rosa Parks as an activist, as a Black woman, right? And the intersections of race and gender in her life. You can have these conversations with 5-year-olds using rich text, right? There's a really good book called Rosa. I think it's by Nicole Giovanni, right? It's a great book, picture book for children. You can have these deep conversations about what it meant to be a Black woman during that time, right? And it sets up all of these wonderful conversations. We have a preschool teacher in Washington, D.C., who's modeling friendship and puppets and acting this out so students can really see, right? So there's an issue with bullying in her classroom, right? So she models it out with the puppet so the students can see it. And the child who does a lot of the bullying is able to then look at this and see what's happening and get another person's perspective, right? And kind of understand where the other students are coming from. They're grappling with stories that don't have an ending. So what can we do, right? There is no resolution in the argument in the story they write. So how do they do that? And they're really, what I love is that they're not preparing them to do this later, they're doing it now. They're treating childhood as this active period where children can do things now and they can grapple with big ideas, right? And then we have this teacher in Milwaukee who really pushed herself to really embrace all of the 13 guiding principles, right? To really think about what does it mean to talk to young children about being queer affirming and transgender affirming, and how that conversation allow a child to connect and bring in a family member who is who's a gay man and considering transitioning, right, their gender. And so this person would have never had that connection to the classroom, right? So this has been so amazing. These teachers are stretching and pushing the foundational work in early childhood of what it means to be anti-bias, to also really examine issues of power and racism. And people think young children can't handle that, but they're wrong. These kids are doing it, and they're I want to follow them. I want longitudinal research to track these children as they get older, so we can see, because I think, you know, we prepare children really well at a young age to think about issues of fairness and justice, but that doesn't follow them in the real world, right? We always talk about what they experience in the real world, and in the real world is anti-Black, and the real world is white supremacist, and the real world is heteropatriarchy, right? So how do we get them to take those ideas in the early childhood years and kind of follow them through, right? And so that's what we're doing with the K through 12 Black Lives Matter at School curriculum that's very intersectional. And so the teachers I see, they're committed to it every day. They're not dusting off the same lessons from before, right? They're trying to expand themselves. They're getting new materials and new books, and they're pushing themselves to really have these really deep conversations. And they're committed to learning themselves, right? A lot of the work we do on these 13 guiding principles, we have to live them. You can't just talk about them. Kids will call you out in a minute if you talk about something that you're not actually about, right? So you have to embody and live these principles. And we're expanding this idea of a year of purpose, where we're really interrogating, right? One of our year of purpose questions asks, what is your relationship to the Black community? Right? Yeah, you're right. Think about that. Schools, right? What is the school's relationship to the Black community besides taking their kids in every day and holding them hostage in these classrooms that may or may not be good spaces? What is your relationship outside of the function of education to the Black community? Are you supporting Black businesses, Black parents, right? Black healthcare, Black wellness? What are you doing? You have to be doing more than just this idea of you're warehousing children because you're required to by the state. You have to have a commitment to Black people, right, in all sense. And so I think we're really exploring that and what it looks and what it means. And teachers are coming into their schools and saying, like you said, that equity statement, that diversity statement, that Black Lives Matter, yes, we love George Floyd statement, is not enough if you don't follow it up with some commitment to change your policies and change your practices. And the teachers that I'm seeing, they're leading that in their school. They're demanding it. They're asking that in interview questions. I'm not going to just go work at your school. Let me ask you, what is your commitment to these issues and what you're actually doing, so that I can determine whether this is a good fit. And that's what we want to see more of, right? That it doesn't just happen accidentally, right? That it's intentionally happening, that we're intentionally changing our schools to focus on.
We would wonder, like, what is the fear when I'm thinking about what happens in Florida when a teacher puts up a white teacher puts up a Black Lives Matter flag, and the candidate for the commissioner of education, I think, I can't remember the exact piece, says that he fired her because of that. We've got governors outlawing critical race theory. What is the fear of white America, Black joy? What is the fear of that?
Yeah, I think that's the fear, right? They don't know, the Black joy is fearful to them. They know a world, they want to keep that mirror the same. They don't want to change the image in the mirror. It threatens their existence to have that mirror expand and welcome other people, right? They don't want to change that sliding glass door to history. God forbid we actually talk about the history of this country in a way that makes sense. America has always aspired to be a great country. In many ways, it falls short, but it can get there if it continues to acknowledge how it's fallen short and how it can strive to be better, right? We all live here. We think we want this country to be really great, but we can't ignore the history, right? You know, I do talk to some teachers and parents. There is some fear, right? It's very different than what we all experienced in school. They're afraid they're not going to know how to communicate to their children. They're afraid their children will come home and call everybody racist. And maybe that's not a bad thing, right? But really what they need to understand is that what we're telling you is that this is what your children need for the future, right? I work in higher education, and every year we have students who are wholly unprepared for higher education. It is not the K through 12 skill and drill preparing for standardized testing. They don't know how to engage in a conversation about a reading. All they're looking for is multiple choice, right? Writing a short, paragraph essay. They don't really understand the complexities of thinking deeply, reflecting, supporting one's opinion, because they're not being prepared to do that in most of the case settings, right? So we're thinking, and they're not prepared to work in diverse spaces, right? They come to these college universities, and the next thing you know, they're engaging in some horrible actions, right? Because no one really took the time to say what is cultural appropriation and why you shouldn't be doing this, right? And so they're unprepared, and they're not going to do well. And we can't continue to make people think, oh, we can just keep being who we are, and we're not going to be. America is not okay, right? We need to do better. We need to prepare our children to do better, because the international students are leading the way, right? They come here and they do an amazing job, and they're fully prepared to engage in this way. And so what are we lacking, right? We're lacking this commitment to the truth, to our history, and to promising to do better. And I think it's really telling, right, that in response to all of the statistics about, we can talk all day long about the outcomes for Black students and brown students in American schools. And their answer to it is, don't teach about racism, don't say Black lives, right? They don't have an answer to these issues. It's like they don't care, right? And that's where the intentionality comes. They're okay with Black students graduating at a lower rate than other students. They're okay with Black students not getting to college at higher rates than other students. They think that that's totally fine. And that's what we have to be honest about. These people are quite okay with the status quo, and they're afraid of change, and they're afraid of what it means to change. And the rest of us have to say, you are a vocal minority. The majority is not okay with the status quo. The majority wants to see improvement, and the majority is also going to be vocal in our response.
Jesse, think about what Denisha just said. I mean, that's it, right? And you ask that question, why would this person fire a white teacher for putting up a Black Lives Matter? It's a recognition of a power shift dynamic that white people like me, a lot of it are saying they're afraid of recognizing that there's a power dynamic shift happening. And as Denisha said, you can either look at that and say it's darn well time, way beyond it, and in fact needed for some form of equity and justice and harmony. But there is the status quo and the power, and that truly white supremacy's hold. There's deep-seated fear of losing status. And I love what Paul Thomas says, their unearned status and power. That unearned, and when he talks about it, it's just because of a white privilege being put in a position where, doesn't mean you didn't work hard, but this unearned. And so there's a huge fear. You talk about this, but then think about empowering the teachers that Denisha's talking about and the candidates working at Jillian's school to become education professionals. How has this become then a concerted movement that looks at and says, this is the type of moral work that teachers, that education leaders, that superintendents want to be engaged in? And then as you think about this, we won't have a teacher shortage. We'll have people bursting to be a part of this movement.
So I want to do I've got a little initiative, hidden request over here, and it's to Dean Velasquez Healy. I think the University of Kentucky can be ground zero, can be the center of change. I'm thinking that we need a summit of civil rights activists, voting rights activists, educational activists, and I think we can go to the University of Kentucky. I think that the Civil Rights Institute there, the School of Education, I think we could bring everyone there for one of the most fantastic, rising, changing conferences ever. I'm putting them on the spot. Yeah. I'm saying, Julian, I will give my heart and my soul to it.
Well, yeah. So let me, what the first question that a dean always asks? How much is this going to cost?
We made money on the Save Our Schools conference, just to let you know that.
I'm only kidding. No, absolutely. We just had a virtual civil rights and education that was roundly lauded. And so absolutely, we absolutely can do that work together. As soon as some of the pandemic concerns are lifted, I think that we can absolutely start that conversation and figure out when we can do that. I just want to say this one quick thing, because I know we got a warning that our time is running short. The reason why you see the attacks on education, the attacks on voting, is because those things are the compass of our democracy. Those are the things that keep us on the path. I don't think there's anything more patriotic. I don't think there's anything more free about critical examinations of our history and our past. And so the idea that there are segments of the population that want to suppress free speech of students and of teachers, essentially violating the Constitution, to me is really problematic, because education, like we say, is the compass of our democracy. And that's why it's so important that at Kentucky and all the other institutions that are a member of EDJE, all the other colleges of education, that we prepare our teachers, because they are our first responders to our nation's challenges. And so we have to have these difficult conversations about race, about gender, about all the challenges that historically marginalized communities have faced in the country. And people understand that if we don't do that, that change won't come. And that's really what they're standing in the way of in making change in our democracy and ensuring that that compass continues in our schools, in voting, et cetera.
Excellent, excellent. So we might be going down to the University of Kentucky. We might be rocking the world. We might be hanging out, and we might be getting some of those like great hash browns that you and I had the last time we were together at the Waffle House. I mean, I never saw hash browns like that. But yes, I think we're at a pivotal moment in public education in America. It is either a public school system that is the school to prison pipeline that domesticates us or liberates us. It is either the schools that give us a nation where all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it has never been that way. So I acknowledge that, but it can be that way. And if it can't be that way in our schools, then it can't be that way anywhere. Thank you, thank you, amen. You three rock the house. I love you. You know, and we gotta hang out together, and I gotta have dinner at Denisha's house. And Tim, I think I should be having some of that Wisconsin cheese with you. And I gotta play golf with Julian, even though I don't play golf, but I'll do it. All right, I love you.
And I know that for certain, keep on working, open curtains, haters swerving, cause they ain't ready for your final version. I'm never gonna give up, fall down, I just gotta get up, yeah. Cause this is my road, let's camera action, I'm ready to go.